R. Real. Réel. Lacan's use of the term real as a substantive dates back to an early paper published in 1936. The term was popular among certain philosophers at the time and is the focus of a work by Emile Meyerson, which Lacan refers to in the 1936 paper. Meyerson defines the real as an ontological absolute, a true being in itself. Meyerson, quoted in Roustang. In speaking of the real, then Lacan is following a common practice in one strand of early 20th century philosophy. However, while this may be Lacan's starting point, the term undergoes many shifts in meaning and usage throughout his work. At first, the real is simply opposed to the realm of the image, which seems to locate it in the realm of being beyond appearances. However, the fact that even at this early point Lacan distinguishes between the real and the true indicates that the real is already prey to a certain ambiguity. After appearing in 1936, the term disappears from Lacan's work until the early 1950s, when Lacan invokes Hegel's view that everything which is real is rational, and vice versa. It is not until 1953 that Lacan elevates the real to the status of a fundamental category of psychoanalytic theory. The real is henceforth one of the three orders according to which all psychoanalytic phenomena may be described, the other two being the symbolic order and the imaginary order. The real is thus no longer simply opposed to the imaginary, but is also located beyond the symbolic. Unlike the symbolic, which is constituted in terms of opposition such as that between presence and absence, there is no absence in the real. Whereas the symbolic opposition between presence and absence implies the permanent possibility that something may be missing from the symbolic order, the real is always in its place. It carries it glued to its heel, ignorant of what might exile it from there. Whereas the symbolic is a set of differentiated discrete elements called signifiers, the real is in itself undifferentiated. The real is absolutely without fissure. It is the symbolic which introduces a cut in the real in the process of signification. It is the world of words that creates the world of things. Things originally confused in the hic et nunc of the all in the process of coming into being. In these formulations of the period 1953-55, the real emerges as that which is outside language and inassimilable to symbolization. It is that which resists symbolization absolutely. Or again, the real is the domain of whatever subsists outside symbolization. This theme remains a constant throughout the rest of Lacan's work and leads Lacan to link the real with the concept of impossibility. The real is the impossible because it is impossible to imagine, impossible to integrate into the symbolic order, and impossible to attain in any way. It is this character of impossibility and of resistance to symbolization which lends the real its essentially traumatic quality. Thus in his reading of the case of Little Hans, in the seminar of 1956-57, Lacan distinguishes two real elements which intrude and disrupt the child's imaginary pre-Oedipal harmony. The real penis, which begins to make itself felt in infantile masturbation, and the newly born sister. The real also has connotations of matter, implying a material substrate underlying the imaginary and the symbolic. See materialism. The connotations of matter also link the concept of the real to the realm of biology and to the body in its brute physicality, as opposed to the imaginary and symbolic functions of the body. For example, the real father is the biological father and the real phallus is the physical penis, as opposed to the symbolic and imaginary functions of this organ. Throughout his work, Lacan uses the concept of the real to elucidate a number of clinical phenomena. Anxiety and trauma. The real is the object of anxiety, it lacks any possible mediation and is thus the essential object, which isn't an object any longer, but is something faced with which all words cease and all categories fail. The object of anxiety par excellence. It is the missed encounter with this real object which presents itself in the form of trauma. It is the psyche which lies beyond the symbolic automaton. See chance. Hallucinations. When something cannot be integrated in the symbolic order, as in psychosis, it may return in the real in the form of a hallucination. The preceding comments trace out some of the main uses to which Lacan puts the category of the real, but are far from covering all the complexities of this term. In fact, Lacan takes pains to ensure that the real remains the most elusive and mysterious of the three orders, by speaking of it less than of the other orders, and by making it the site of a radical indeterminacy. Thus it is never completely clear whether the real is external or internal, or whether it is unknowable or amenable to reason. External, internal. On the one hand, the term the real seems to imply a simplistic notion of an objective external reality, a material substrate which exists in itself independently of any observer. On the one hand, such a naive view of the real is subverted by the fact that the real also includes such things as hallucinations and traumatic dreams. The real is thus both inside and outside. See extimacy, extimité. This ambiguity reflects the ambiguity inherent in Freud's own use of the two German terms for reality, Wirklichkeit and Realität, and the distinction Freud draws between material reality and psychical reality. Unknowable/rational. On the one hand, the real cannot be known, since it goes beyond both the imaginary and the symbolic. It is like the Kantian thing in itself, an unknowable X. On the other hand, Lacan quotes Hegel to the effect that the real is rational and the rational is real, thus implying that it is amenable to calculation and logic. It is possible to discern in Lacan's work from the early 1970s on an attempt to resolve this indeterminacy by reference to a distinction between the real and reality, such as when Lacan defines reality as the grimace of the real in Lacan. See also Seminar 17, page 148. In this opposition, the real is placed firmly on the side of the unknowable and unassimilable, while reality denotes subjective representations which are a product of symbolic and imaginary articulations, Freud's psychical reality. However, after this opposition is introduced, Lacan does not maintain it in a consistent or systematic way, but oscillates between moments when the opposition is clearly maintained and moments when he reverts to his previous custom of using the terms real and reality interchangeably. Reality principle, principe de réalité. According to Freud, the psyche is at first regulated entirely by the pleasure principle, which seeks to experience satisfaction via a hallucinatory catexis of a memory of prior satisfaction. However, the subject soon discovers that hallucination does not relieve his needs, and is thus forced to form a conception of the real circumstances in the external world. A new principle of mental functioning is thus introduced, the reality principle, which modifies the pleasure principle and forces the subject to take more circuitous routes to satisfaction. Since, however, the ultimate aim of the reality principle is still the satisfaction of the drives, it can be said that the substitution of the reality principle for the pleasure principle implies no deposing of the pleasure principle, but only a safeguarding of it. From early on, Lacan is opposed to what he calls a naive conception of the reality principle, that is, he rejects any account of human development based on an unproblematic notion of reality as an objective and self-evident given. He emphasizes Freud's position that the reality principle is still ultimately in the service of the pleasure principle. The reality principle is a delayed action pleasure principle. Lacan thus challenges the idea that the subject has access to an infallible means of distinguishing between reality and fantasy. Reality isn't just there so that we bump our heads up against the false paths along which the functioning of the pleasure principle leads us. In truth, we make reality out of pleasure. Recollection, remémoration. Recollection, remémoration, and remembering, mémoration, are symbolic processes, which Lacan contrasts with reminiscence, réminiscence, which is an imaginary phenomenon. Whereas remembering is the act whereby some event or signifier is registered for the first time in the symbolic memory, recollection is the act whereby such an event or signifier is recalled. Reminiscence involves reliving past experience and feeling once again the emotions associated with that experience. Lacan stresses that the analytic process does not aim at reminiscence but at recollection. In this sense, it differs from the cathartic method invented by Joseph Breuer, in which the emphasis was placed on the discharge of pathogenic effects via the reliving of certain traumatic events. While it is true that intense memories may be evoked in psychoanalytic treatment with accompanying emotional discharge, this is not the basis of the analytic process. Reminiscence is also linked by Lacan to the Platonic theory of knowledge. Recollection in the treatment involves the patient tracing the master signifiers of his life, or in other words, the realization by the subject of his history in his relation to a future. By means of recollection, the treatment aims at the complete reconstitution of the subject's history and the assumption of his history by the subject. What matters is not reliving the formative events of the past in any intuitive or experiential way, which would be mere reminiscence, or even worse, acting out. On the contrary, what matters is what the analysant reconstructs of his past, the key word being reconstruct. It is less a matter of remembering than of rewriting history. Regression, régression. Freud introduced the concept of regression in the interpretation of dreams in order to explain the visual nature of dreams, basing himself on a topographical model in which the psyche is conceived of as a series of distinct systems. Freud argued that during sleep progressive access to motor activity is blocked, thus forcing thoughts to travel regressively through these systems towards the system of perception. He later added a passage to this section distinguishing between this topographical kind of regression and what he called temporal regression, when the subject reverts to previous phases of development, and formal regression, the use of modes of expression which are less complex than others. Lacan argues that the concept of regression has been one of the most misunderstood concepts in psychoanalytic theory. In particular, he criticizes the magical view of regression, according to which regression is seen as a real phenomenon in which adults actually regress, return to the state of a small child and start wailing. In this sense of the term, regression does not exist. In place of this misconception, Lacan argues that regression must be understood first and foremost in a topographical sense, which is the way Freud understood the term when he introduced it in 1900, and not in a temporal sense, see time. In other words, there is regression on the plane of signification and not on the plane of reality. Thus regression is to be understood not in the instinctual sense, nor in the sense of the resurgence of something anterior, but in the sense of the reduction of the symbolic to the imaginary. Insofar as regression can be said to have a temporal sense, it does not involve the subject going back in time, but rather a re-articulation of certain demands. Regression shows nothing other than a return to the present of signifiers used in demands for which there is a prescription. Regression to the oral stage, for example, is to be understood in terms of the articulation of oral demands, the demand to be fed evident in the demand for the analyst to supply interpretations. When understood in this sense, Lacan reaffirms the importance of regression in psychoanalytic treatment, arguing that regression to the anal stage, for example, is so important that no analysis which has not encountered this can be called complete. Religion, religion. Freud renounced the Jewish religion of his parents, though not his Jewish identity, who considered himself an atheist. While he regarded monotheistic forms of religion as a sign of a highly developed state of civilization, he nevertheless thought that all religions were barriers to cultural progress, and thus argued that they should be abandoned in favor of science. Freud argued that religions were an attempt to protect oneself against suffering by a delusional remolding of reality, and thus concluded that they must be classed among the mass delusions of humankind. He saw the idea of God as an expression of infantile longing for a protective father, and described religion as a universal obsessional neurosis. Lacan too considers himself an atheist, having renounced the Catholic religion of his parents. Lacan's brother, however, spent most of his life as a Benedictine monk. Like Freud, he opposes religion to science and aligns psychoanalysis with the latter. Distinguishing religion from magic, science and psychoanalysis on the basis of their different relations to truth as cause, Lacan presents religion as a denial of the truth as cause of the subject, and argues that the function of sacrificial rites is to seduce God to rouse his desire. He states that the true formula of atheism is not God is dead, but God is unconscious, and echoes Freud's remarks about similarities between religious practices and obsessional neurosis. Beyond these remarks on the concept of religion, Lacan's discourse abounds in metaphors drawn from Christian theology. The most obvious example is surely the phrase "the name of the Father," which Lacan adopts to denote a fundamental signifier whose foreclosure leads to psychosis. However, this is far from the only example. Thus, the changes wrought by the symbolic are described in creationist rather than evolutionary terms, although paradoxically, Lacan argues that this creationism is actually the only perspective that allows one to glimpse the possibility of the radical elimination of God. In the seminar of 1972-73, he uses the term God as a metaphor for the big other and compares feminine jouissance to the ecstasy experienced by Christian mystics such as Saint Teresa of Avila. Repetition. Freud's most important discussion of the repetition compulsion, Wiederholungszwang, occurs in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he links it to the concept of the death drive. Freud posited the existence of a basic compulsion to repeat in order to explain certain clinical data, namely the tendency of the subject to expose himself again and again to distressing situations. It is a basic principle of psychoanalysis that a person is only condemned to repeat something when he has forgotten the origins of the compulsion, and that psychoanalytic treatment can therefore break the cycle of repetition by helping the patient remember, see acting out. In Lacan's pre-1950s work, the concept of repetition is linked with that of the complex, an internalized social structure which the subject repeatedly and compulsively reenacts. At this time, Lacan often translates Freud's Wiederholungszwang as automatisme de répétition, a term borrowed from French psychiatry, Pierre Janet, Gaëtan Gatian de Clérambault. While Lacan never completely abandons the term automatisme de répétition, in the 1950s he increasingly uses the term insistence, France instance, to refer to the repetition compulsion. Thus, repetition is now defined as the insistence of the signifier, or the insistence of the signifying chain, or the insistence of the letter, l'instance de la lettre. Repetition is fundamentally the insistence of speech. Certain signifiers insist on returning in the life of the subject despite the resistances which block them. In schema L, repetition insistence is represented by the axis capital A, capital S, while the axis small a accent represents the resistance or inertia which opposes repetition. In the 1960s, repetition is redefined as the return of jouissance, an excess of enjoyment which returns again and again to transgress the limits of the pleasure principle and seek death. The repetition compulsion manifests itself in the analytic treatment in the transference, whereby the analysant repeats in his relationship to the analyst certain attitudes which characterized his earlier relationships with his parents and others. Lacan lays great emphasis on this symbolic aspect of transference, distinguishing it from the imaginary dimension of transference, the affects of love and hate. However, Lacan points out that although the repetition compulsion manifests itself perhaps most clearly in the transference, it is not in itself limited to the transference. In itself, the concept of repetition has nothing to do with the concept of transference. Repetition is the general characteristic of the signifying chain, the manifestation of the unconscious in every subject, and transference is only a very special form of repetition. In other words, it is repetition within psychoanalytic treatment, which cannot simply be equated with the repetition compulsion itself. Repression, refoulement. The concept of repression is one of the most basic concepts in psychoanalytic theory and denotes the process by which certain thoughts or memories are expelled from consciousness and confined to the unconscious. Freud was first led to hypothesize the process of repression through his investigation into the amnesia of hysterical patients. He later distinguished between primal repression, a mythical forgetting of something that was never conscious to begin with, an originary psychical act by which the unconscious is first constituted, and secondary repression, concrete acts of repression whereby some idea or perception that was once conscious is expelled from the conscious. Since repression does not destroy the ideas or memories that are its target but merely confines them to the unconscious, the repressed material is always liable to return in a distorted form in symptoms, dreams, slips of the tongue, etc. The return of the repressed. For Lacan, repression is the fundamental operation which distinguishes neurosis from the other clinical structures, whereas psychotics foreclose and perverts disavow, only neurotics repress. But what is it that is repressed? But without the but. What is it that is repressed? At one point, Lacan speaks of the signified as the object of repression, but he soon abandons this view and argues instead that it is always a signifier that is repressed, never signified. This latter view seems to correspond more closely to Freud's view that what is repressed is not the affect which can only be displaced or transformed, but the ideational representative of the drive. Lacan also takes up Freud's distinction between primal repression and secondary repression. 1. Primal repression, German Urverdrängung, is the alienation of desire when need is articulated in demand. It is also the unconscious signifying chain. Primary repression is the repression of the first signifier. From the moment he speaks, from that precise moment and not before, I understand that there is repression. Lacan does not see primary repression as a specific psychical act localizable in time, but as a structural feature of language itself. Namely, its necessary incompleteness, the impossibility of ever saying the truth about truth. 2. Secondary repression, German Verdrängung, is a specific psychical act by which a signifier is elided from the signifying chain. Secondary repression is structured like a metaphor and always involves the return of the repressed, whereby the repressed signifier reappears under the guise of the various formations of the unconscious, in other words, symptoms, dreams, parapraxis, jokes, etc. In secondary repression, repression and the return of the repressed are the same thing. Resistance. Resistance. Freud first used the term resistance to designate the unwillingness to recall repressed memories to consciousness. Since psychoanalytic treatment involves precisely such recollection, the term soon came to denote all those obstacles that arise during the treatment and interrupt its progress. Whatever disturbs the progress of the work is a resistance. Resistance manifests itself in all the ways in which the subject breaks the fundamental rule of saying everything that comes into his mind. Though present in Freud's work from the beginning, the concept of resistance began to play an increasingly important part in psychoanalytic theory as a result of the decreasing efficacy of analytic treatment in the decade 1910-1920. See interpretation. As a consequence of this, ego psychology placed increasing importance on overcoming the patient's resistances. Lacan is very critical of this shift in emphasis, arguing that it easily leads to an inquisitorial style of psychoanalysis which sees resistance as based on the fundamental ill will of the patient. Lacan argues that this overlooks the structural nature of resistance and reduces analysis to an imaginary dual relation. Lacan does accept that psychoanalytic treatment involves analysis of resistances, but only on condition that this phrase is understood correctly in the sense of knowing at what level the answer should be pitched. In other words, the crucial thing is that the analyst should be able to distinguish between interventions that are primarily orientated towards the imaginary and those that are orientated towards the symbolic, and know which are appropriate at each moment of the treatment. In Lacan's view, resistance is not a question of the ill will of the analysant. Resistance is structural and it is inherent in the analytic process. This is due ultimately to a structural incompatibility between desire and speech. Therefore, there is a certain irreducible level of resistance which can never be overcome. After the reduction of the resistances, there is a residue which may be what is essential. This irreducible residue of resistance is essential because it is the respect for this residue that distinguishes psychoanalysis from suggestion. Psychoanalysis respects the right of the patient to resist suggestion and indeed values that resistance. When the subject's resistance opposes suggestion, it is only a desire to maintain the subject's desire. As such, it would have to be placed in the ranks of positive transference. However, Lacan points out that while the analyst cannot and should not try to overcome all resistance, he can minimize it or at least avoid exacerbating it. He can do this by recognizing his own part in the analysant's resistance, for there is no other resistance to analysis than that of the analyst himself. This is to be understood in two ways. 1. The resistance of the analysant can only succeed in obstructing the treatment when it responds to and or evokes a resistance on the part of the analyst. In other words, when the analyst is drawn into the lure of resistance, as Freud was drawn into the lure of Doras's resistance. The patient's resistance is always your own, and when a resistance succeeds, it is because you, the analyst, are in it up to your neck because you understand. Thus, the analyst must follow the rule of neutrality and not be drawn into the lure set for him by the patient. 2. It is the analyst who provokes resistance by pushing the analysant. There is no resistance on the part of the subject. Resistance is the present state of an interpretation of the subject. It is the manner in which, at the same time, the subject interprets the point he's got to. It simply means that he, the patient, cannot move any faster. Psychoanalytic treatment works on the principle that by not forcing the patient, resistance is reduced to the irreducible minimum. Thus, the analyst must avoid all forms of suggestion. The source of resistance lies in the ego. In the strict sense, the subject's resistance is linked to the register of the ego. It is an effect of the ego. Thus, resistance belongs to the imaginary order, not to the level of the subject. On the side of what is repressed, on the unconscious side of things, there is no resistance. There is only a tendency to repeat. This is illustrated in schema L. Resistance is the imaginary axis, object small a, to object small a accent, which impedes the insistent speech of the big other, which is the axis capital A to capital S. The resistances of the ego are imaginary lures, which the analyst must be wary of being deceived by. Thus it can never be the aim of analysis to strengthen the ego, as ego psychology claims, since this would only serve to increase resistance. Lacan also criticizes ego psychology for confusing the concept of resistance with that of defense. However, the distinction which Lacan draws between these two concepts is rather different from the way in which they are distinguished in Anglo-American psychoanalysis. Lacan argues that defense is on the side of the subject, whereas resistance is on the side of the object. That is, whereas defenses are relatively stable symbolic structures of subjectivity, resistances are more transitory forces which prevent the object from being absorbed in the signifying chain.